Good morning, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to be here today. My name is Tom. I'm a director at Milltown Partners, which is the firm that's helped convene the AI Fringe. Based in San Francisco, I mostly work with technology businesses and help them sort of communicate about the opportunities and potential threats and risks from emerging artificial intelligence systems. Real pleasure to be here today, helping convene this first panel. This is the Elliott Room, breakout room of the Fringe. We're going to have 3 sessions in here today. The first has been co-convened with Which and is going to be on the topic of AI slop. We have, become increasingly familiar with the consumer applications of AI, as we've seen ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and many of the chatbots that are powered by these tools become an increasing part of daily life. It means consumers are becoming familiar with both the benefits, but also, of course, some of the downsides of AI. We've seen some of the low-quality, harmful, manipulative outputs of generative AI systems. We've all become familiar with chatbots that give false medical advice, or that sort of feeling of trying to get, your bank's kind of consumer chatbot to actually understand what it is you mean when you're trying to ask for customer services help, for example. But there are also some more pernicious harms, things like fraud as well, that I think the panel's going to be unpacking today. So the sort of overall contention here is that as AI systems become increasingly powerful, more ingrained in our lives, getting that consumer trust right is going to be even more critical to adoption. We've actually seen this in some of Milltown Partners' own research. We've done some focus grouping, for example, with policy-informed audiences. They actually have a pretty informed and nuanced understanding of what some of these downsides and risks of AI are, that they can lead to biased outcomes or reduce transparency and decision-making, can leave people feeling disempowered. They want information and choices about how AI is used in their lives. So I'm hoping the panel is going to touch on some of these overall themes. Wanted to, just kick this off. So if you could please help me give a warm welcome to Simon Newman, Dr. Francine Ryan, Colette Collins-Walsh, and Michael McAteer for a conversation that's being moderated by Dr. Zimeta. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all for making it today, and I'm looking forward to a really lively discussion. So yes, as Tom said, my name is Zimeta, and I lead the digital and data policy at which is the UK consumer champion. We're a wholly independent charity created in 1958 to advocate for consumer rights, consumer protections, and consumer redress. So some of our wins in the past have been things like, addressing lead in children's toys, washing machines that blow up, kind of advocating for redress around late trains that run late and when you paid a full fare train ticket and so on. Things that are part of safety and protection for the UK, for consumers in the UK. Most recently, you might have seen we launched a £3 billion landmark legal case against Apple, claiming that they are in breach of competition policy for their customers of their iCloud services. So we do what we can to make things simpler and fairer for everyone. And so I lead the digital and data policy team, and we're looking at those issues, particularly in the digital tech ecosystem, which includes AI. And as Tom said, for a lot of us, our experiences of AI as consumers have been of quality of products and outputs that are low quality, that are harmful and malicious. I think what people call AI slop. But the other half of the title is consumers say no, right? So it's what can we do as consumers to change that and help AI fulfill its potential for us and for society and economy through that. So we've got this excellent expert panel. I'll just do a quick round of introductions. So Mick McAteer is co-director of the Financial Inclusion Markets Centre. He specialises in financial inclusion and the intersection of finance and tech, and he's been a passionate advocate for social justice and financial markets for a while. So welcome, Mick.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Colette Collins-Walsh is head of UK affairs for Five Rights, which is an international NGO that works for and with children to ensure that the digital world respects their rights and meets their needs by design and by default. In the UK, Five Rights successfully campaigned for groundbreaking protections for children in the Online Safety Act. So welcome, Colette. We also have Dr. Francine Ryan, Senior Lecturer at the Open University and Director of the Open Justice Centre. Francine has pioneered innovation in technology-driven learning opportunities for Open University students. She's co-authored books on technology and for technology and lawyers. And she's leading a UKRI responsible AI project, AI law and legal training, to produce free, open educational resources on the use of generative AI for understanding legal processes. Welcome, Francine.
Thanks, Millie.
And finally, Simon Newman, who's the CEO of the Online Dating and Discovery Association, which is a global trade association, recognises the voice of the online dating and social discovery sector, working towards a sector that is working on behalf of consumers creating safe, trustworthy and positive dating and social discovery experiences while working on innovative solutions to the challenges. So welcome, Simon.
Thank you, Millie.
So we'll do a couple of rounds of questions and then a rapid round at the end, and then we'll open to audience questions if we have time. So it's Valentine's Day later this week, which means I have to begin with Simon. So Simon, how is AI playing out in online dating? What are you seeing in your sector?
Sure. Well, thank you, Millie, and good morning, everyone. Yes, one of the busiest times of the year for the online dating sector, with Valentine's Day, as you say, being on Friday. I guess there are three things I wanted to perhaps talk about. Two sort of positive things, and then one perhaps not so positive, and that sort of talks about some of the risks that we're seeing from the use of AI. So first of all, online dating as a sector is growing significantly. It generates around about £300 million a year to the UK economy. Ofcom's latest statistics suggest around 1 in 10 of the adult population have used one or more online dating sites over the past 12 months. Obviously, the sector grew significantly as a result of the pandemic and continues to grow, not just in the UK, but internationally. And in fact, in the US, around about 30 or 40% of the population use online dating sites. So it's certainly a very big market. We are certainly seeing the use of AI increasingly being used by online dating companies, first of all, in a way that they are able to connect people with others. So some are using quite sophisticated AI as a way of being able to make matches more closely, based on perhaps behaviours or psychological assessments that they're able to carry out. And so that's improved the customer experience in many ways. So, you know, the days of perhaps swiping through hundreds of potential profiles before someone that closely matches what you're looking for is going to be a thing of the past as AI makes that journey much easier. So that's one really positive thing. The second side, which I think is something we're very passionate about at the moment, is where there are a lot of really good innovative AI companies who are developing products and services that help with things like content moderation. So being able to look for perhaps abusive behaviour or images, for example, that are inappropriate, and being able to not only detect those, but remove those really, really quickly. And there's a lot of work going on at the moment all around the world with some really great companies out there. And that bolted onto the human side that the trust and safety teams within these online dating companies is a very, very powerful mix. And we certainly encourage more of that development going forward. We are, of course, seeing as well AI being used for things like chatbots and help as well, to help consumers. Again, we've seen examples where AI has been able to spot perhaps people in distress or with perhaps mental health issues. And again, that's being able to flag that quickly to trained professionals within these dating sites to be able to support their users. So there's a few things that are happening on the very positive side. On the negative side, obviously we've seen a significant rise in the last few years of very sophisticated deepfakes, and it's really quite amazing how good the technology is becoming. If I go back 2 or 3 years ago, it was relatively easy for a human being to be able to spot a deepfake. The image didn't look quite right, perhaps the voice didn't sound quite right, there were glitches and so on. These days, the technology and the capability is so much better that it's becoming almost impossible for the average human to be able to spot. And so we're having to rely on technology to be able to spot when a deepfake is present. And to give you an idea, we do a lot of work in trying to educate and hopefully prevent romance scams. Romance scams are a major issue. It's a priority crime for UK policing. And of course, you can be a victim of a romance scam on any social media site or any online platform. And in fact, more likely these days on other types of platform. But deepfakes is becoming a major issue, and that's one of the concerns we've got at the moment. It is becoming much, much harder to spot. So hope that's helpful. Two reasonably positive things, but also something perhaps not so positive that we are obviously concerned about.
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon. So, Francine, Simon's highlighted some of the ways in which generative AI is being used intentionally to manipulate or to deceive. I know that you've been looking at the use of generative AI in the legal sector. Is it the same sorts of intentions to manipulate and to deceive? What are you seeing there?
No, I think we're looking at it from a slightly different perspective in the kind of the legal sector. So we all know that AI is not new, but what is new is generative AI, which is now freely available. But that technology is in its really early stages of development. But it's freely accessible, so consumers, people out there can use it in whatever form they want to. And in a legal context, there's a real significant risk with people in the public using it to ask legal questions, and we know that's happening already. And I think that's something to do with in terms of how the models are trained. So a lot of the information is coming from the internet. Lots of the models have been developed by US companies. So the outputs often default to US law. So if you enter a legal question, depending on the prompt and the quality of your prompt, the response is very likely to default to US law. And if you're a regular person just using it, you won't necessarily know that that's US law. You might not even know where that law is. And sometimes, not only is it the kind of US law problem, but it's the kind of UK law problem. But we have 4 different legal systems. So we don't have this idea of UK law in that kind of straightforward way. And so different laws apply in different jurisdictions. And so if you don't know which jurisdiction you're in, that can be really problematic. So just to give you a really small example of that, in Wales, they have something called the Renting Homes Act, which looks at tenancy, and that's different in Wales to the law in England. So if you pop that in your chatbot and you don't know whether you're in Wales or you're in England, you're going to get different advice. And it's all about how you phrase those prompts. But if you don't know what you're looking for, you might not necessarily phrase those prompts correctly. So, and also in this kind of legal context, we've also had quite a number of incidences of hallucinations. So the chatbot wants to help you. It's really, really keen to help you. So it will invent some cases, it will invent some statutes. Whatever you need, it will help you along the way. And we're in a situation with lots of consumers now where people can't afford legal advice. So the lack of access to lawyers is hugely problematic. People have used things like the internet to help them. So now they have the opportunity to use AI for legal help. And so that can be problematic because we know we have this issue of digital exclusion. So some of the work that I've been involved in, some of the research that I've been doing is looking at different models and testing them. And what we know is that the paid-for versions are better than the free versions. And so if you're somebody who can't necessarily afford a lawyer, you are much more likely to be using a free version as opposed to a paid version, and therefore the quality of that response is going to be even poorer. So that's a real risk for us. And the other thing around the disclaimers on these products, so the products T's and C's say, they're not meant to be used for legal advice, please consult a lawyer, etc. But if you can't afford a lawyer, you can just ignore those disclaimers, and the risk is that you will just carry on using it for legal advice. And going forward, I think some of the things that we are concerned around is that obviously companies like OpenAI are making really significant investments in this space. They're going to need to recoup these costs so that models will get more expensive. So what do we do in this space? Are we going to further entrench structural inequality? There's been a real reduction in legal aid. So since 2012, we've had most of civil legal aid removed. So lots of people can't afford a lawyer. Lots of people are representing themselves in legal proceedings. And there's a real risk that AI will exacerbate this divide. And governments, in terms of their funding, we've seen this reduction in legal aid. Lots of different law centres are really struggling to provide in-person advice. And there is kind of this shift to digital for access to justice, but that brings lots of potential risk with it. So while technology has real potential to support access to justice, we really need to be really cognizant of the unintended consequences of what might happen in this space.
Thanks, Francine. That's really timely. I think it was last week the government published its digital government plan, its blueprint for digital government, and there's going to be a real emphasis on digitising public services.
Absolutely.
But may I just check something with you? So you're saying that when people use these legal chatbots, it tries to give an answer even if it doesn't know?
Yeah, because the way it's trained, it's there to help you. So if you can ask more and more prompts, it will find ways to try to help you.
It won't just say, I don't know.
So it often will not say it doesn't know, depending on the quality of the prompts and depending on the ones that you're using, but yes. And the problem is you don't know, you're not checking, if you're not legally trained, you're not checking the output, you don't know whether the output is right or wrong, and that's the issue. So we've seen incidences of people in cases, there was one in Manchester, of somebody using a fictitious case to support their case because they didn't know it was a fictitious case. Why would they? So that is a real big problem for us.
Thanks, that's fascinating. It makes me think of a child trying to come up with answers to be helpful. So then we'll move to Colette, actually. This is really interesting, speaking of children. So when the government published its AI action plan last month, at which we noticed that there was no mention of consumers at all. It was all about AI for the economy, society and government. Nothing about consumers, consumer protection. We put something out about that. But I saw that Five Rights also put something out saying that there'd be no mention of children in the government's AI action plan. I think that's really interesting. So can you say a bit more about that gap?
Yeah, I think, at Five Rights, we advocate for children's rights in digital spaces, and something that we've been really concerned about is that children are just nowhere in the conversations we're having about AI, either opportunities for them or risks. And that's a big problem for two reasons. Like, the first is that children are early adopters of technology, and we know that they're using things like AI chatbots at a higher rate than adults are. And the second reason is because they're just a lot more vulnerable to a lot of the risks and things that we've been talking about so far, just because they're still developing. They're still developing their critical thinking skills, their communication skills, their reasoning skills, which just means that they're a lot more likely to trust what a bot is telling them or the information it gives them. And that is sort of leading, I guess, to sort of, when we think about things that they're using, we give AI chatbots sort of human-like qualities. So we say that they're thinking and they're reasoning and they have general intelligence. And often as well, these chatbots will give that to themselves too. So they will say to children that they're their friend. And then children then are sort of, I guess, using sort of chatbots just socially or just for fun. And the bot is asking them lots of questions to keep the conversation going. And a child is much more likely to tell it sort of personal and sensitive information. And then all the while, in the terms of service, it will say, anything that you input into this bot, we will use for our own purposes, or we may give to a third party. But a child doesn't really understand the implications of that. I suspect a lot of adults don't either. But for children, they really, really don't. And that's not to say that they're sort of all bad. I was speaking to a teenage girl recently about why she uses sort of a chatbot. And she said, I feel like I can't speak to my parents about this, and I can't speak to my friends, and I just really feel that, it's not going to judge me, it's not going to tell anyone what I've said. So it's not all bad, but then we do also know that this sort of vulnerability that children have to it can have very harmful consequences, and there have been cases now of children who have been given very harmful information and instructions on chatbots. And there are also cases as well of how predators are using AI as well in order to harm children. And anyone who wants to know a bit more about that, I would direct them to research by the NSPCC put out towards the end of last month on this, and a lot of the work by the Internet Watch Foundation as well, who concentrate on this.
Thank you, Colette. And I also appreciate the call out that, look, these aren't identities, these are systems. And I noticed that when I was speaking to Francine, I said, doesn't the chatbot just say, I don't know? And it's very difficult to remember that it's not an I, it's an it, So, and I'm an adult, so thank you, that's really, really helpful. And I know that at which we've done some research, to find chatbots that are recommending harmful products to adults, right? So if they're doing that to adults, then the thought of, them being in dialogue with a child and the child not necessarily knowing that the product's harmful. Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you. So, Mick, you've been a board member of the Financial Conduct Authority, which is the UK regulator for financial services. You've chaired the European Commission's Financial Services User Group, but perhaps most importantly, you are also an alumnus of which.
That's right.
Congratulations.
That's right, yes. a long time ago. It's like back in the days of printed paper and things,
Well, I mean, still. Okay, great. So, tell me, how are you seeing AI affecting consumers and their financial products or financial services, such as loans, mortgages, and overdraft applications? Those sorts of things.
That's a really, really good question, Millie. Look, I think the first thing to say is this isn't new. AI is an evolution of existing practices in financial services and other markets, but particularly in financial services. And the reason I say it is because financial services is built entirely on segmentation and customer profiling. They use technology and big data to put people into boxes according to whether or not you're a high risk or low risk from the firm's point of view, not from society's point of view, but from the firm's point of view. And they put you into another box about are you high profitability or low profitability or whatever. So you're segmented and profiled according to risk and profitability. Now, that's always been the case in financial services, certainly in the modern financial era. Anyway, discrimination and exclusion happened in the analog days, before technology. But the problem is that technology, whether it's machine learning or big data and now AI, threatens to really exacerbate financial exclusion and discrimination. Again, simply because markets profile people according to profitability and risk. At the risk of sounding like Jeremy Corbyn here, but capitalism awards value to people with economic power, you know, and it penalises people who don't have economic power or who don't conform to the sort of the firm stereotypes of a good customer. So the essence of AI, like any other technology, is that in the old days, it was actually quite difficult for firms to profile consumers. They could either profile mass markets on a very, very shallow level, or they could deeply profile small groups of consumers, you know, using sort of market research. The difference nowadays is that firms can profile mass markets of people in depth, in real-time basis, and that is the real game changer when it comes to the application of technology and now AI to the profiling of consumers. As I say, discrimination and exclusion already happened under the analog days. It could get worse because of AI, and already 75% of financial services companies use AI in the market. 95% of insurance companies use it in the market. Now, so far, most of that is around operational efficiencies, and I think we'll come on to the reason why are they picking it up. But we are seeing about a third of them are now using this technology for profiling consumers and for credit scoring and so on. That number will actually grow. So the risk is that exclusion and discrimination will become exacerbated. But that isn't the only harm, really. We're also very concerned about the ability of firms to use AI to manipulate people's behavioural biases and psychological attitudes as well. You know, and again, because they can do this in real time, they can monitor people, you know, people with bipolar, for example. They can monitor people on the ups and the downs and sell them products at their most vulnerable times as well. So it isn't just exclusion, it's about behavioural biases, so on. And of course the scams issue as well. You know, we're seeing types of scams and fraud that we have never ever seen before. So yeah, I mean, look, like any market solution, market initiative, there'll be some winners, you know, but there are going to be lots of losers as well, because that's just the way markets work, unless we intervene at this stage using precautionary approach to regulation to put the guardrails in place to make sure that that harm doesn't become even more widespread.
Thank you, Mick. That was really interesting. And when you were talking about capitalism, it made me remember some years ago I went to a workshop on I think it was AI and religion, and they were saying, look, the technology has been rolled out in an age of global capitalism and to drive the ad tech sector, right? And that's why it's got the functions that it has. But can you imagine a different kind of AI, say if it was stewarded by the Dalai Lama? But I think it's really valuable because it makes you separate the technology from the economic context and the social context and realize the technology may not be the problem. It's just exaggerating what's
exactly.
already there.
And the role of trusted intermediaries like which is going to become even more important, because with AI, I mean, in financial services, people are expected to understand and compare the products. Now they're going to have to understand and compare the AI models that generate the choices that are being presented to them. So, you know, you guys are going to play an increasingly bigger role in making sure that the models that are actually selecting the products to be presented to the consumers and the models that are actually sorting the consumers into these different boxes, it's going to take trusted intermediaries to intervene to make sure that those models are run in a way that is economically and socially useful for society, not just for the firms that rely on them. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting to think that actually there's a layer of kind of like actually transparency about the models, not just about the products, because you can go to magazines or websites to get recommendations about different financial products, but getting more information about the AI models behind them. Thank you. I just want to pick up also on what you were saying about the way that the financial sector's personalising things, and you described the downside of that, personalising the kind of like removing risk from the company and putting penalties on customers, or kind of like modelling behaviour in a very granular way to market things to people at different times or according to their psychological profiles and so on. It made me think of personalised healthcare, and that's the positive version of that, where healthcare can be personalised and tailored to an individual. And are there any other similarities between, say, the financial sector and, say, the health sector?
But it's like anything. As I say, I mean, the fundamental principle to remember is that markets segment. Okay. If you're an empowered consumer, if you're a wealthy consumer, if you have wits on your side, you'll get a good deal. But if you don't have money, or if you're vulnerable for whatever reason, or you don't fit the risk profiling, you won't get a good deal. And the personalising of any service, any product or service, whether it's pharmaceuticals, healthcare, financial services, or whatever, tends to benefit those minority of consumers that are genuinely empowered and confident and are capable of actually engaging with market-based provision. So, some people will do well out of personalised healthcare. unless that leads to...
Including vulnerable people who might not be able to be captured by that.
But I mean, again, it really depends on whether, as I say, it's a zero-sum game. Unless the technology results in an overall improvement in the delivery of services, then if it's a zero-sum game, if somebody wins, somebody loses because there's a finite amount of resources. So the same will happen in financial services, as it always has done, is that those who are empowered, wealthy, who can employ financial advisors, who can subscribe to which magazine or whatever, they'll get a good deal out of AI-driven financial services. But that means, the people who don't get the benefit are going to, by definition, in a zero-sum game, will lose out, unless, as I say, the technology results in an overall improvement in the delivery of services and raises the game for everybody.
Yeah.
There's no evidence that technology actually improves the game across the board. There's been no increase in productivity in financial services since 1902. This is the problem. There's been massive increases of technology into the market. No sign of actual useful productivity gains as measured by the benefits delivered to the end consumer. So yeah, I mean, some people will win. Some people will get better personalised products and services. Other people are going to be left out and actually face even greater penalties because of the application of technology and data, of course.
No, thanks, Mick. That's really, really interesting, especially given how important the financial sector and financial services sector is to the UK economy.
Absolutely.
So, Colette, Mick has highlighted some of the ways in which AI is kind of rolled out into an industry and amplifying how that industry or that sector is already working. Is that the same kind of trend that you're seeing in terms of how AI is being introduced to children, that's amplifying what's already there? Is there something different going on? Tell us about it.
Yeah, definitely. I think I would agree in terms of we know how sort of risk and harm manifests for children online. We've thought a lot about it over the last decade or so. Lots of smart people have done lots of work on it, and we have technical standards. So in some ways we kind of know what it is. It's just that AI amplifies it and spreads it at a very rapid rate. And I think and the principle about why this happens is because these products are quickly launched to market and they're just not built with any safety or children's well-being in mind, really, or even the idea that children will be using these technologies. And as I said, they tend to be early adopters. And then what happens is then something goes wrong, and then a safety measure is hurriedly put on at the end, which doesn't tend to be very effective, and is actually it's much more expensive for the company to do it that way, to just tag things on. And also usually when that's happened is a child's already come to harm, children are already coming to harm. So it's a much better way to think about children from the get-go, just for everyone, for children and the people who are building these products.
Thanks. That's a really interesting tension. On the one hand, they're not designed with children in mind. On the other hand, children are early adopters. That's a massive gap and contradiction.
Yeah, it is. But like I said, this isn't a new thing with AI. This is just all technology. If you think about the last decade or so with social media, that's the biggest example of where that's happened. It was quickly launched to market. And I guess at the time, we didn't even really think that children would be using it. But actually, companies do want children to use their products, so they should be and they can be designed, it's worth saying as well, in age-appropriate ways, which does not diminish the experience for adults either. It really is possible to do that.
And thanks for mentioning the social media example, because we know that children pick up digital tech, and yet this gap keeps on happening. So it's just a really interesting gap that keeps on resurfacing in this conversation, that we didn't, there hasn't been thought about children picking up, even though we know that they do, and even though they're early adopters. So, Francine, you mentioned in the previous comments about the importance of digital economic inequalities and how these might be playing out in legal tech and so on. And Mick's also said about economic inequalities and how they're playing out with, I guess, fintech and so on. So are those the main drivers of the risks that you're seeing in AI in legal services, the economic inequalities? Is that the biggest risk or the biggest driver?
I think it's a kind of a mixed picture. I think we were talking when we were prepping for this about, unintended consequences or awareness. And I think a lot of what we're talking about is about creating awareness. So, for example, if you take things like ChatGPT, that wasn't designed. It's not designed for legal advice. It's just a general purpose tool. But the reality is it's being used in ways that it was never effectively intended to. And I think that's part of this kind of conversation that we're all having. And it's kind of this understanding piece about how these tools have been developed. So, for example, lawyers have access to subscription databases, which are all behind paywalls. So we know these kind of models haven't been trained on these legal databases. And so that's why they produce risks, because they have been trained on things that have been scraped off the internet. And that's why they produce fabricated and misattributed outputs. And we're in this really difficult situation with legal advice. I mean, I am a lawyer. Of course, I will say that everyone should have advice from a qualified lawyer. That's what we do. But actually, you know, it's the risks that come from relying on these tools and those recommendations by these tools if you don't know where to check that information. So there are some fantastic things like Which, Citizens Advice, lots of organisations that are there to support people. But often people want a kind of quick answer. And the thing about the AI responses that I think is so difficult is that they just appear so believable. They are so good. And if a user doesn't know their subject matter, they don't know it's necessarily inaccurate or misleading. And if you haven't got access to a lawyer, then you're going to use those as your sources to help you. And people make lots of presumptions around what's reliable and not reliable. So there's been some work done around looking at some advice produced by ChatGPT and advice produced by lawyers, been done by Josh Crooks at Southampton University. And people preferred the answers, they didn't know who had produced the answers, but they preferred the answers produced by ChatGPT. And that's because they sound really authoritative. Lawyers generally caveat everything, as you know, but legal situations are rarely straightforward. So, you know, we avoid as lawyers giving definitive answers because we know that legal cases are subject to interpretation, we have judges, etc. Whereas AI, on the other hand, is much more definitive. It produces responses that really appear factually correct. They find it very definitive, and people like that. People want an answer, and an AI will give you an answer. But if you can't necessarily interrogate the quality of that answer, that is the problem. And making people have that awareness and not be sucked in by what's there I think is the real issue, particularly where we are in a situation where people can't afford to get legal advice from lawyers, and we are seeing so many people representing themselves, particularly in things like family cases and employment cases, where of course you're going to turn to these tools because they give you an answer, and a very quick and easy answer. And I think it's about this. I think the awareness piece is just so important.
Thank you. And, you know, we've got this phrase AI slop in our title, and often you can tell when it's AI slop because it just looks fake. And my favourite example, there's a couple of my teammates in the room, I'm sorry I'm going to repeat it again. My favourite example is Shrimp Jesus. You know, when people were using AI to do kind of images of Jesus as a shrimp. So you can look at that and you think, okay, that's just really bad quality. It's just not very good. Like, that's obviously not real, you know. So there's AI slop that you can tell is AI slop. Whereas what you're describing is something that looks very authoritative, looks very persuasive and so on. And so that doesn't look like AI slop, but actually...
Absolutely.
It's not exactly good for us.
And if you don't understand how the tools have been trained, you don't understand where the information is coming from, you won't know. And it's people have been unintendedly misled in that way, and I think that's the problem.
Yeah, by something that looks very convincing.
Exactly.
Yeah, or that looks as if it's good value for money, and especially it's been free.
Yeah.
So thank you, Simon. So Mick talked about some of the kind of the ways in which people who can be defined as socially vulnerable in different ways could have unfavourable experiences of AI in financial services, at which you mentioned scams, romance scams and so on, at which we have an active fraud programme. And what we found is that actually anyone can be a victim of online fraud. You can't profile by kind of, economic vulnerability or so on, because anyone can be taken in. And so what we did was we looked at the psychological impacts of being a victim of fraud, particularly because people think they won't be, And we found that actually it's very harmful, but also has a kind of a social and collective cost and a cost to the economy too. So just highlighting and I'm just thinking about, that's online fraud in general. I'm thinking about romance scams and the particular psychological pain and vulnerability that must come with that, and the difficulty in getting help. So I think the work you're doing is really valuable. What can we be doing to address these kinds of romance scams that are happening online, particularly the ones that are driven or exacerbated by AI?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point. I mean, you're right. The psychological impact of online fraud is huge, and romance scams are a particularly nasty type of crime, which have devastating impacts on individuals, and sadly, lead to some people taking their own lives. They are properly heartbreaking. Some of you may be familiar with a story that happened in France recently, where a lady was duped into believing she was in a relationship with Brad Pitt. unfortunately sent the scammers a significant sum of money and divorced her husband as well. And one of the things I just wanted to highlight there as well is these scams become more and more sophisticated. I said earlier it's becoming harder to spot them. One of the things we're not doing particularly good at as a society in general is we are victim shaming, and I think that's something that is a really, really big problem. Again, I go back to that lady in France who was trolled pretty much online. How could you be so stupid to fall for something that very clearly, why would Brad Pitt be interested in you, when he's a Hollywood A-list star? And it's that type of thing that we're not very good at. As a result of that, people don't report. So we end up, I think in the UK, around about 5% of online fraud is reported to the relevant authorities. It's often incredibly difficult to take enforcement action. Most of these types of scams are perpetrated by highly organised, very, very technical scammers based over in the Far East or in jurisdictions where it's very difficult to bring them to justice. And so it almost creates this perfect storm where the technology has made it much, much more easy for criminals to use this technology to target victims. And you say it's indiscriminate. Anyone that uses an online platform of any description could be a victim. And we all like to think in this room, we're all potentially quite tech savvy, but the reality is, as you've said, it's very commonplace. So I think there's a few things we can do. One of the things is around education and awareness, and it's about just keeping people aware of the types of scams that are there. One of the things we've been talking about recently is about better information sharing. So the types of criminals I mentioned earlier, they're targeting our sector, they're targeting Mick's sector, they're targeting your sector. They are generally the same people, but we're not very good at sharing that information amongst different industries or different sectors. We can spot trends, we can spot patterns. The sooner we can alert these sites to the types of behaviours, potentially we can make a bigger impact. So that's one thing, and it's a real sort of thing, personal passion is to try and get better at that information sharing and bring people around the table. I think the other thing is, I use this term friction, and it's a really interesting discussion we're having at the moment about building more friction into processes. So whenever we get onto an online platform, we simply just want to log in, whether it's a fingerprint or we just remembers our password. Fantastic, ease of use, we've got used to it. But actually, we need to build in a bit of friction. We need to verify who the person is to make sure they are who they say they are. So we need to undertake some checks. Now, at the moment, and the technology is improving all the time, there are some barriers. There are some checks that will take a bit of time. But I think we need to educate users of online platforms. Get used to a bit of friction. Friction will keep you safe. It will help us make sure that people on those platforms are who they say they are. And over time that friction will reduce as the technology improves, but it's just another way we can tackle this. And again, it's about forums like this, getting together cross-industry, sharing that information, and trying to stop these really organised, highly sophisticated criminals from targeting the British public.
Thanks, Simon. That's so interesting about introducing friction because, of course, part of the appeal of AI is the speed and the ease, and you're actually saying, hang on, slow things down, and then you get better quality. Okay, so we're a bit short on time, so I'm going to do a rapid round of questions to close, so like 30 seconds each, and then if you could just get ready with your questions so you can join the discussion, that would be great. So I'll do Colette, then Mick, then Simon, then Francine. Get ready. So 30 seconds, what does good look like? Like, how can we make AI work for consumers and make it fulfill its potential for society? So let's do Colette first.
Well, going back to what I said at the beginning, just even the fact that we're having this conversation and talking about children as consumers and users of these products is a really big start. And we really need to see policymakers and decision makers sort of centering children and thinking about how they're really using these and making sure that their safety is being thought of before they're deployed, before they're launched. And like I said, very quickly, a lot of this work, we know how risk comes to children online. So it's just about applying that learning to AI products and services.
Thanks. It's like inclusive innovation, but inclusion to also think about children as part of inclusive innovation. And I think almost everyone in this room grew up in a world where AI was science fiction, but they're going to grow up in a world where it's AI science fact. So starting to prepare for that. Brilliant. Thank you. Mick, what does good look like for consumers when there's AI in financial markets?
Yeah, well, I mean, good means improving the financial well-being of the maximum number of consumers while minimising the harm to the maximum number of consumers. But that is going to require a precautionary approach to regulation, and there's no sign of that happening at the moment because growth and competitiveness is now just driving every other consideration out of the policy arena. Everything has been subordinated to the growth and competitiveness of financial services industry. So yeah, and because of what's happening in America, what's happening in the European Union, there's a real risk of regulatory arbitrage and a race to the bottom on standards, not an enhancing of standards. So yeah, not terribly optimistic, you know.
I think I'm a bit more. I mean, I think consumers have power, right? We have collective power. We may not have individual power, but collectively.
Some do. Yeah.
But I think collectively, and I think for me that's what Which is. It's the collective voice of consumers.
I agree.
So,
what would be good is if trusted intermediaries like Which got in there and drove standards up and stopped the worst from happening. Because individual consumers have got very little power in markets.
Yeah.
The economic textbooks say that markets are driven by suppliers and consumers. That doesn't happen in the real world. It's only a minority of consumers actively engage in markets. It needs trusted intermediaries and regulators to drive up standards. Yeah.
I think you're right. It's got to be collective. It's got to be the group and not just a few.
Absolutely.
That means everyone. Hope you're taking note. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Simon, what does good look like? What can we do? What action can be taken now?
Yeah, well, thanks, Millie. And I think picking up on what Mick was saying, really. So I have this goal or this vision of what I call an informed consumer, which is kind of a nod to exactly what Which do. I think if consumers are more informed about what AI is, the advantages and the risks, it's them that are empowered to kind of ask those questions. So, you know, if you're on an online dating site, go and ask them about what are they using technology for? What safeguards are they put in place? How are their trust and safety processes working? So the more information, the more informed you are, I think the more powerful, and that will change behaviour across the industry. So I think that's the first thing in terms of what good look like. The second point is around frameworks. And I think we've got this really interesting balance we need to strike. On the one hand, we really want to encourage innovation. We want to see really innovative solutions that give us the opportunity to embrace the technology and the opportunities it brings, whilst also keeping us safe. But equally, we don't want to create a framework that kind of stifles innovation or puts barriers in our place. And I know that's a really difficult challenge for policymakers. So I think, you know, conversations with industry, and that's my plea, the action, get round the table with industry, with different sectors, and let's try and find ways forward that can use this technology in a really, really positive way.
Brilliant, thank you. I love the idea of just asking the platforms, what's your policies, how does this work?
Absolutely.
Going to do it, yeah. Thank you. So, Francine, last word to you. What does good look like? What do we need to do?
So I think we need to recognise the genie's out of the box. People are going to use these tools. And there's a real positive aspect of it for access to justice. It might be really helpful. But for me, good looks like education and training. I think there's a huge public education piece we need to do around this, so people are aware of how these tools work, the ramifications, and it's about awareness and it's about critical thinking, getting people to ask the right questions. And if we can do that, then I think I am optimistic that things, you know, we can use them in a way that's going to be helpful to people.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think something like this panel, as we've been saying, is exactly that.
Absolutely.
It's that public education, it's asking the right questions, it's finding out what the right questions are.
Yeah.
So thank you, you've been really helpful.
Thanks.
Okay, so opening up the floor now, we've got about 5 minutes for questions. So please put your hands up and the mic will come over. Okay, so I can see 2 hands up, so let's take them 2 at a time. Oh, 3 hands up, okay. So let's take, yeah, okay.
Okay, Zil, yeah. I was just wondering if you could touch briefly on the idea of automated decision-making in consumer products. Mick touched on AIs deciding what your insurance premium might be, for example. Simon touched on AIs deciding who you get matched with on dating apps. Lots of people in this room will be aware of high-profile examples from benefit fraud detectors to job matching algorithms, but it's not so much directly the consumer interacting with AI. So what can industry do better, and how can society hold those people to account a bit? Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's a question here. Yes. Okay. And then I think there's one over there and one over there.
Yeah, you have insisted on the fact of helping consumers to ask the right questions, and that aligns also with the need to have more and more transparency. But the problem that we are having here is how can we make sure that when delivering this transparency, how can we make sure that non-tech people who will not necessarily understand the very technical aspects of the models behind understand to a sufficient level how the decisions are made, for example, or how the recommendations are being produced.
Brilliant, thank you. So there's, I think, a question on automated decision-making and improving the quality of it. Is that
quality and understanding why it's making decisions.
Yep, so accountability, transparency, and I think the second question is also about, well, there's transparency, but also understandable transparency. Yep. Okay.
I totally agree with you. Just share a very, very quick story. I'm on a board of a non-profit. There are 5 directors. 2 new ones joined, myself and a colleague, and the bank account is with the Challenger Bank. I won't name them. However, we went to go through their online process, and we both failed the process for whatever reason. Computer says no, and it shut down our entire bank account. Now, the point I'm making there is not only was that incredibly frustrating, but that was a decision that was made by a computer, and there was no recourse. I couldn't pick up the phone and speak to someone and say, just tell me, what have I failed in here? What have I clicked that's wrong? I did a credit check afterwards. Everything was fine, as did my fellow director. So I think the point I'd make is you can't rely on this technology 100%. There needs to be a human element to it. That's really, really important. So the two need to work hand in hand. In the future, maybe AI becomes so informed that we can do away with some of that and it can make decisions that are of greater quality. But I think at the moment, we mustn't jump two-footed into this and just accept or expect AI to do all of those automated decisions without some form of scrutiny from a proper person at the other end.
And how do we make that scrutiny understandable to consumers?
Yeah.
So, Mick?
Look, again, I hate to be a downer in this one, because I'm from Northern Ireland. It's like, whenever we see a silver lining, we look for the clouds, But look, I'll take those two things together: the transparency and the decision-making thing, because I think as I said, the AI is an evolution of existing technology and big data. But the one thing that really, really worries me is that I think more and more of decision-making has been delegated, and responsibility for decision-making has been abdicated from the people who run firms to AI models. That's going to be the really difficult thing to challenge. That is going to require regulators and Which magazine and others to get in there and set the standards for those models, including around transparency. But again, I've got to say, the idea that you're going to get an empowered group of consumers challenging the transparency of AI models, to such a degree that the AI models are driven up in quality. It just doesn't, history doesn't show that works. In the past we had financial education. Everybody put every bit of resource into financial education in the expectation that this would drive up standards in financial services markets. It had almost no impact on financial markets. All the meta-analysis shows that financial education had very limited impact on consumer behaviour or corporate behaviour. Given the complexity of AI models, I think transparency on its own is going to have very, very limited impact on driving up the standards and the integrity and the quality of AI models. It'll take Which magazine, it'll take government, it'll take regulators to get in there and set the standards for the outcomes of the models, not just revealing the transparency of how the models actually work. We're going to have to tackle the outcomes created by those AI models.
So I actually wonder if there's a the fact that this technology is being picked up by children, and also children and young people are saying some of the most entertaining ways of expressing themselves about the technology, like AI, slop, and so on. These are phrases from teenagers. I'm just wondering if that could help with the transparency and accountability and understandability, that even though it is a highly technical subject matter, I think the way it's being discussed in pop culture, for example, might be able to make it more accessible than something like financial products and services. Colette?
Possibly, but I think I agree with Vic in terms of we need government really to step in here and to act, and also a duty of care really to be put on whoever's using ADMs or automated decision making to, first of all, be across what data is this being trained on? Are you confident that it's clean? Are you confident of what the input was? So I really think that Of course, education for children is really important, so important. But it's part of a much broader ecosystem of safety, really, and the duty really needs to be on the people who are very quickly, as we discussed, launching products to market.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where the responsibility lies. I'm conscious of time. I'm wondering if we can take one more quick round of questions. Brilliant, thank you. So I saw a hand up there, and I think there was a hand up somewhere here. Okay, yeah, I think.
Thank you. Dr. Ryan, you gave us a very good example of an illegal advice from an AI system where the consumer doesn't know whether the advice is right or wrong because they're not a lawyer. Lawyers sometimes are wrong as well.
That's true.
Can we get to an AI system, maybe narrowly trained on legal advice, that can be as good as a lawyer or better?
I think it's a really interesting thing. I think, definitely it depends on the data you put in there and the quality of that. I would say that the problem with that is the reality is that law is much more nuanced. It's not fact-based. You need to look at interpretation and things like that. So I think that, yes, AI could definitely help lawyers. It already is. So we're seeing, Alan Overy have Harvey. I think Sims have Percy. So it certainly will be used as a productivity tool and supportive tool, and hopefully will make legal advice cheaper, definitely in that space. But I still think that human-in-the-loop aspect is so important, and getting someone to check the output. So yeah, maybe in the future we'll have these amazing AI lawyers, but I think we're not there yet in that sense.
Thank you. I think we have one more. Is that... Okay.
Thank you. I work in public participation, so I guess my question will be framed by that. I'm really interested in the framing of this entire discussion around consumers and the roles of consumers. And I think, Mick, to your point around what our expectations are of consumers, we also have expectations as citizens, and we have expectations of our government and the systems around us. So I'm just interested in whether you think that AI poses a kind of challenge to the sort of social contract that we have as consumers. Is that qualitatively different, or is it just about pace?
Yeah. Can I have a go at that? Because I think that's one of that is such an important question. I mean, I'm just focusing on consumers today. We haven't really talked about the citizen consumer intersection or the social contract around the use of AI. I mean, what I find interesting is that over the years, there's been a really big improvement in consumer rights in this country. If you're a middle-class consumer, you've got really powerful rights when it comes to regulators, well-resourced regulators, ombudsman schemes and whatever. But if you're a citizen having to deal with the state, and if you're a vulnerable consumer having to deal with the state, you have nowhere near the same rights or protections as you have as a middle-class consumer dealing with markets. Now, all the concerns I have about the impact of AI in consumer markets, I have exactly the same concerns about the impact of AI in the public sector. Not in terms of its potential for improving public services, but what it'll mean for vulnerable citizens who have to engage with the state as their primary financial provider, as their primary service provider. They do not have anywhere near the same rights. I used to chair an anti-poverty charity called Z2K. We give free legal advice to people who'd been sanctioned by the DWP. The way they were treated by the system was really, really appalling. And I do worry that if we move towards sort of AI-driven public services, then the computer says no model. The impact on vulnerable citizens who are living literally from hand to mouth, I think is going to be even more detrimental. So I think those are the really big questions we need to be addressing as well. Yeah.
Thank you. And I really agree with that. And when I was looking at the kind of the digital government blueprint, I noticed that, look, some of the chatbots that are planned to be used in the public sector will have been developed in consumer markets first, right? Absolutely. So I think we do have power and influence because these technologies are being used with consumers first and then moving into the public sector. So I think we have a role in setting the norms and sort of setting the kind of expectations about what we will and won't expect and how we will and won't interact with things. But on the, I think we need to wrap up now, and I want to make sure you get time to go to a coffee break. So I think that although we're here talking about the use of AI in markets that affect consumers, and the use of AI, we've just touched on the use of AI in government and digital public services. I want to flag that at which we also have a data science team who use AI, but they use AI in our advocacy work, and that's different from, say, using AI as an organisation around operational efficiency and the things that most organisations do. We use AI in our investigations. We use our AI to uncover consumer harms, to get evidence of things going on in markets, to take that to policymakers and regulators, say, look, this isn't working. And I think that's just really important for us, that we're both using AI creatively in a political way, as well as critiquing the politics and economics of AI. And we have teach-ins in our department every few weeks or so, and exclusively for the Fringe, we're opening up one of our teach-ins today. So at 1 p.m. online on Zoom, if you dial in, you can attend one of our teach-ins with our chief data scientist on how we're using AI in our advocacy and policy work to investigate and uncover consumer harms. So I'm afraid I do have to end there, but thank you very much for being such an engaged and lively audience, and I hope you continue to stay engaged, and not just as an audience, but as consumers, and stay active in this realm and ask the right questions, as we've said. And I want to thank the panel for really lively discussion, really fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you.